Welcome everyone to the NIU Art Museum's virtual event this evening. I'm Stuart Henn, the museum's education coordinator, and it's my pleasure to welcome you and introduce our speaker this evening. A few notes about the presentation. This Zoom meeting is being recorded, so you can rewatch or invite others who are not able to join us live tonight. The video will be uploaded to our events page after it's been formatted for web viewing. To minimize interruptions, everyone has been muted except for our presenter this evening. Feel free to ask questions in the chat, and I'll help moderate those at the end of the presentation, time allowing. Programs of the NIU Art Museum are sponsored in part by the Illinois Arts Council Agency through federal funds provided by the National Endowment for the Arts, the Friends of the NIU Art Museum, the College of Visual and Performing Arts season presenting sponsor Shaw Media, and the NIU Arts and Culture Fee. Tonight, I'm happy to introduce Landis Blair, author and illustrator of the Envious Siblings and Other Morbid Nursery Rhymes, and illustrator of The Hunting Accident, a true story of crime and poetry, the graphic novel by David Carlson, which won Best in Adult Books from Excellence in Graphic Literature in 2018. Blair is a 2012 Eustace Tilley Grand Prize winner from The New Yorker and founding member of the Order of the Good Death, a group that advocates for natural burial practices. Mirth and Mayhem, Landis Blair Selections of Drawings and Books, is on view at the Art Museum until February 26th and contains illustrations by Blair whose stories contain elements of taboo, nihilism, and whimsy. With that, it's my pleasure to turn our screen over and introduce tonight's speaker, Landis Blair. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Stuart. And thank you everybody who is tuning in here. I wish we could do this in person. But I'm glad that we have the opportunity to do this. But I guess given the weather, maybe this is better anyway. But also thank you so much to Stuart and to Josephine Burke at the museum for organizing this exhibit and for wanting some of my drawings to be on display. But I'm going to, let's see, share my screen here to get this presentation. Okay. So I am as Stuart said, I'm an illustrator and an author, and so I do a number of different things in those capacities. And so I thought it would be helpful at least to kind of start out by showing you some examples of the various things I do. And the first kind of group of things I'll show you is what I would lump more into kind of illustration and or freelance illustration. But so this first drawing up on the screen here, this was a commission from independent bookstore in Chicago called Unabridged Books, and they're in the bottom floor of this old building. So they commissioned me to draw the building that they're in, and then they took this image and they printed it on tote bags, which they sell in the bookstore there. This second drawing here, this was a drawing I was asked to do for a museum exhibition that they were doing a show with the theme of Memento Mori, which is kind of the classic art history theme of Remember You Will Die. And this was one of my submissions that I entered into that show. Another kind of illustration I do is magazine illustration or article illustration. This was an illustration that accompanied a story or a firsthand account of spending time and working up in Alaska. And then I also do a number of memorial pet portraits. So people have commissioned me to do drawings of their dead pets to remember them by. And well, I guess also, you know, cats and dogs and the hamsters. I had somebody commission a shrimp once, which was was a bit odd, but it was a fun challenge. But they're not all dead. Also, you can see like Boris up there. There's a blank left for when he is no longer with us. But this is another kind of side project that I'm always doing. And then lastly, this is an example of, I guess, what I would call installation art. I mean, it was still commissioned, but this is a very large drawing I did of a map of Memphis, and this drawing was then enlarged to 10 feet wide and printed on glass and backlit, and it's now in the lobby of this building. You can see in the illustration the Commonwealth in Memphis, downtown Memphis, and there's two other illustrations that they did the same thing in that lobby. So that was a very, I mean, that's still a kind of illustration, but it also involved different logistics of kind of this physical install. So those are a bunch of examples of just kind of various illustration work that I do here and there, but the work that's most important to me, or at least I consider to be the most fulfilling, or what I want my career to concentrate on, is book illustration or book creation, I guess, because some of them I'm writing the stories as well. So this takes several forms too. So the first form are these little books that I print myself that are kind of more what I would consider experimental work, but the great thing is that there's no limitations whatsoever, because I'm just the only one producing these, and it allows me to explore an idea or something that might be a little bit too crazy to, I don't have to get permission from a client or have to worry about what they think. It's just something I want to explore because I feel compelled to do so. And so this is an example of one of these little stories about an anemone, and this is one of the illustrations in it. And so these little books, they vary in size, but I think this one had like 12 or 13 illustrations with text accompanying them. So another form of book illustration, though, is what Stuart mentioned, this graphic novel called The Hunting Accident. And this was a 450-page graphic novel that I illustrated. It's based on a true Chicago crime story. And so this is an example of one of the 2-page spreads within the book. And then another kind of book illustration that I work on is, I guess, what you would just call spot illustration. And so this is a nonfiction book on different death customs around the world that's written by Caitlin Doty. Stuart mentioned that organization I'm a part of, the Order of the Good Death. Caitlin Doty is the one who started this organization, and she's a mortician and death advocate for changing funeral practices. But this book, she traveled around the world and examined different death customs and what we could learn from them and what we can change and where we should go from there. But within this book, I did approximately 45 of these illustrations that are interspersed. And some of them are full page illustrations, like the one on the right. And then other ones, like on the left, are these small illustrations that are nestled within the text. And then lastly, and most importantly to me, or most exciting, is this book, the Envious Siblings and Other Morbid Nursery Rhymes, which is a book that I both wrote and illustrated. This is my most recent larger project that came out. And this is the first time that I put out a full large book that it was both my writing and illustrations. And this is a collection of 8 different morbid nursery rhymes. And so, like, some examples of these illustrations, I don't have the text on here, but this one is from a nursery rhyme called My Suspicious Sister. And it's about this little girl, and her older sister, or at least her parents tell her this is her older sister, is the skeleton, but there are always these ominous hands moving the skeleton above the panel, and the younger sister is not quite catching on, or she slowly is catching on, I should say, of what's happening. Another example from this book is this illustration from a story called The Refinement Tree. It's about a little boy who climbs up a tree and he falls, and as he falls, he hits the branches, and every time he hits a branch, he loses an important memory from his past. So he's slowly kind of becoming empty inside. And then this is just one more example. This story is called The Awful Underground, and a little girl goes aboard a subway looking for her mom. She's been separated from her mom, and as she's sitting on the subway, every time the train stops, a different monster gets on and eats one of the other passengers, and nobody else notices except for the little girl. And so these are some examples of the work I do with book creation, whether it's my own words or somebody else's. But this gives you a really good sense of kind of the range of things I work on. And I'm extremely grateful to be able to do this kind of work. But it's kind of funny when I look back on my past and my history. I never could have imagined that this was even a career possibility. It wasn't something I planned for. I couldn't have even known how to plan for it, because this these opportunities are not something that you could just decide to do and then go out and make them happen. And so moving forward in this presentation, what I want to do is since I've shown you kind of what I do, I want to show you now what path I took to get to this career. So just kind of like a brief synopsis of how my career developed to this point. But then after that, to explain a bit more some of the creative tools I use both in creating my stories as well as then how I create the drawings technically, the physical process of building up these works. So I decided to go to art school, and I studied figurative painting and drawing. And these are examples of some of the paintings from my senior art exhibit in undergrad. And I love drawing and painting portraits. And my plan at the time was that I was going to go to graduate school, and then at some point I would likely teach. And this was the plan that felt good to me for my career, and I was excited about this. And so I applied to a bunch of MFA programs my last year of undergrad, and I didn't get into any of the schools at all. And so that was my first kind of big lesson in that you can't always plan how your career or life is going to go. But I tried again the next year and applied to different schools, and actually including NIU, funnily enough. But again, I didn't get into any of the programs, and so I was kind of left in a weird kind of dejected state. And so when I finished this process, and I was kind of too depressed to apply to schools anymore, I started working at an art gallery in Chicago. And I did this for about 2.5 years, and I was working full time, and I really enjoyed it. And it was still pertaining, I was working with art all day long, and so it still felt good. But the downside was, I'd basically stopped doing my own painting and drawing. But I started thinking, this is okay. I could, this would be a good career for me. And then the recession hit in 2008, and the gallery promptly closed, and I found myself without a job, and I was unemployed for about a year. And so that was just kind of the next big lesson of it's very difficult to plan for how your life is going to go. But in retrospect, that the gallery closing and that year of unemployment ended up being the best thing that could have ever happened to me, because I basically recommitted myself to painting and drawing. And so in those, when I found myself unemployed, I started painting and drawing every single day. And I kind of made a pact with myself that I was never going to let this go again. And so in those couple years following this, when I was re-diving into creating artwork, I really fell in love with this author and illustrator named Edward Gorey. And I'm guessing that a lot of you know who Edward Gorey is, or at least are familiar with some of his illustrations, or have at least his style maybe looks a little familiar. But he was known for these dark, morbid picture books that he would make, and I think he wrote and illustrated about 75 of these, and in addition to illustrating and doing book covers for countless other books that weren't his own. And when I started looking at these more and more, I was completely captivated by both the drawings and the stories, and how these cryptic pieces of text interacted with these mysterious illustrations. And I couldn't figure out why, or I had no idea why I loved this work so much, but I did. And I kept staring at it and staring at it. And I was talking to a friend at the time, and I was being very melodramatic and bemoaning to the friend. And I said something to the extent of, oh, I wish I could have done something with my life like Edward Gorey and done something like this. And I should point out that I think I was all of 24 or 25 at the time, and acting like my life was over. And my friend basically called my bluff and said, well, why don't you just make some of your own stories? And I thought about it, and I realized, oh, they're right. And so I spent the next few months working on my own version of what I thought, or what an Edward Gorey story is. And I wrote and illustrated this little book, which is called The Progressive Problem. And actually, a number of the illustrations from this first little book I did are in the museum show. So if you're on campus and I know it's difficult with the COVID restrictions, but if you're able to get to the museum, you can see this as well as a number of other ones. But this little story is about a cat, and the cat has a problem. The cat can't quite make it to the litter box. And this causes a bunch of problems with the cat's owners. They're frustrated, they try all different things and nothing seems to help. And they get so frustrated, they lock the cat in the basement, and eventually they make the rash decision to take the cat out and they abandon it by the side of the road. And the cat takes several weeks and journeys back trying to get home, and getting thinner and thinner and weaker and weaker. And the cat finally gets back to the driveway and collapses and dies. And I realize this is an extremely morbid and sad little story, but the process of creating it scratched some itch that I didn't even know kind of I had. And I just love the process of creating a narrative in this format with a little bit of text and the illustration. And so I made, printed, had some self-published some copies of this book, and I just love this process so much that I immediately started another little book. And this time I did this story about these horrible, nasty little children who for some reason take a dislike to their crossing guard, and they end up murdering him and stuffing him in a storm drain. But after they do this, the children start getting killed by cars while they're crossing the street. And so the children are trying to find a solution to this. And a number of other bad things happen to these children. Along the way, they try hiring a blind dog who lives in the alley. And the text on this illustration was, "The situation did not improve." And again, I loved this process of creating this book, and kind of this just kind of diving into this dark humor for fun. I mean, I wasn't making money off of this. It was, I was printing these little books. It felt so good to hold this object that I created, and that I could show it to somebody and they could experience it. And so I kept doing more and more of these little books. And eventually I decided to try going to a comic convention in Chicago, and I got a table. And I don't think even break even for the weekend, but I had a great time, just interacting with people and getting to show my work with more people. And what happened at this convention, somebody picked up my business card. They didn't talk with me at the show, but shortly after the show was over, I got contacted to come in for an interview to illustrate a graphic novel. And a long story short, several months later, I found myself working full-time illustrating what would become The Hunting Accident. And this is something, going back to what I was talking about planning my career, like I absolutely could not have planned for this or even imagined that this was possible. It was only because I was making these little books that I had no reason to make, except that I really, really felt compelled to do them, and they made me happy to produce them. And because I was doing that work and then went to the comic convention, somebody saw what I was doing and thought, oh, they can help us with this project. I think they might fit with that. So this project, The Hunting Accident, I'm not actually going to talk too much about this book, even though it was a monumental project. I spent about 3 years working on this. But I believe there is going to be an exhibition, possibly in the future at the school sometime next year, with some of the originals. The COVID has kind of changed the schedule around. I'm not sure if this is still happening, but if that happens, I'm guessing we'll come back, the author and I, and talk more specifically about this story. But just to give you a better sense of kind of the scope of this book, these are a couple other examples of pages, without the text, which we had put on digitally afterwards. But you can see how I fully enmeshed myself in that cross-hatching style that I got from looking at Edward Gorey's work. I just fell more and more in love with it, and kind of created my own version of it throughout this book. And so here's this is actually one of the last spreads in the book, which I suppose is appropriate for, you can see the Chicago skyline there in the background, but appropriate for the weather outside today and in the past couple of weeks. But so fast forward a bit with, I finished working on this book, and suddenly, after these several years of intensely working on this project, I found myself again without a job and kind of like trying to figure out what to do with myself. And so I did the most logical thing I could think of, and I went back to making little books about dead cats and horrible, awful little children. And so this illustration here is from a story called The Regressive Solution, which is actually a sequel of sorts to that first book about the cat, the Progressive Problem. And this is actually the same cat from the previous book. So the cat is dead at the beginning. And the difference this time, though, is somebody finds this cat and takes pity on it and tries to take care of it. And then I made more of these little books, and then one I had a lot of fun making this little book. It was just a completely silly idea that made me kind of giggle, and just it was fun to play around with. I made this very simple nursery rhyme about these two sisters who envy each other's body parts and keep tearing them off and playing with them irreverently. And so these are a couple of pages. Abby envied Angie's hand, lopped it off, and formed a band. Abby envied Angie's eye, plucked it out, and bounced it high. And it was just a pure kind of exploration of nonsense and fun. And I again printed a little book that came out, and I gave it to a bunch of friends. And then if you move forward, probably about a year and a half or 2 years after this project, a remarkable thing happened. An editor saw this little book, and he fell in love with it, and he said he wanted a whole book of these morbid nursery rhymes. And so that ended up becoming this project, the Envious Siblings and Other Morbid Nursery Rhymes, which which came out maybe 2 years after that first conversation with the editor. So again, I never could have imagined that I would be doing this kind of work, or that somebody would be paying me to make a book of my own, like, dark little morbid nursery rhymes. It's not something that even it's not a career path that you think of. Like, it's far too specific, and yet I'm so grateful to be in this position and able to spend my time on doing projects like this, that where people have trusted me to create something that that is unique and I wouldn't say missing, because I don't think that the world needs this book, but that it fills some hole that this is the kind of book that I would have loved and devoured if I saw it. So that's kind of my brief history of how I got to this point of this career. I didn't plan to be an illustrator or author, but it just sort of happened because of these choices I was making on what I wanted to pursue, just because I enjoyed it. So I'm going to very soon talk about kind of a couple of the creative tools I use to make these stories, as well as my technique. But before I do that, I thought maybe I would read to you one of these nursery rhymes from the book and show you the illustration. So I'm going to read to you Honorable Beast, which is the lower right one there. This is actually my favorite one in the book, but I hope you enjoy this. So, Honorable Beasts. Oh, sorry, I advanced that one too fast. There we go. Hester, said Mother, you're being a pest. Go elsewhere till dinner and give me a rest. I hate you, screamed Hester from deep in her chest, before stomping off at this hurtful request. While crying with anger and some indignation, bemoaning her mother's imposed segregation, she saw out her window with deep agitation a tiger appearing without explanation. Hello, said a tiger. Please join me outside. Poor Hester just stared with her mouth open wide, while pondering deeply before she replied. I thank you, she said, but I'm too terrified. Tut, tut, said the tiger, your fear I can see, and tigers are fierce, but I do guarantee your safety and merriment, if you agree to come to my lair and have dinner with me. Oh my, Hester said, it sounds lovely, but no, my mother won't like it and won't let me go. I see, said the tiger, but I'm not your foe, and you're not my only friend coming, you know. Hello, said a bear, I am charmed to be sure, and dinner with you has a special allure. With you as our guest, we will put on our furs. What a night we will have, what a feast will occur. Then Hester let out a most pitiful sigh. My mother will yell at me until I cry, for she's making dinner, expecting me nigh. Pish posh, said the tiger, just look who's nearby. Hello, said a gator, how sumptuous you seem. And you at our table? Oh my, what a dream. I'm so excited, I almost could scream, he said with a smile and teeth all agleam. How tempting, said Hester, to join in your feast. But if you knew mother, your welcome would cease. She'd call you all wretched, dishonorable beasts, and keep me inside for a year at the least. How sad, said the gator, your mother sounds horrid. And, said the bear, her judgment's distorted. But, said the gator, you will be supported, for joining with us will ensure she is thwarted. It seems, said the tiger, that I missed my cue. In my excitement, I failed to tell you. Your mother will be at our fine dinner too. And the bear and the gator responded, it's true. Then Hester cried out an ecstatic whoopee and promptly climbed out of her window with glee. This changes everything. Now I am free to make very merry with mother and thee. And what a fine picture the four of them made. They danced and they sang as they marched through the glade. They strutted and rollicked and never once strayed en route to the lair in their beastly parade. At last, said the tiger, now do step inside. Discover what gaiety we can provide. Hurrah, said the gator, and how, bear replied. And Hester with gratitude promptly complied. And lo, how the feast was displayed with great flair, the best decorations, the best silverware. And true to their word, Hester's mother was there, prepared on the table, plump and cooked rare. So thank you for bearing with me and listening to that. This was the story in the book that I definitely had the most fun, I guess, both writing and creating. So moving on from this, the actual projects I've done, talking about creativity itself and coming up with stories or developing these stories. And while there's numerous different things that are involved when creating anything, I find that the works that I'm most proud of, or I think the best are the best pieces of work that I do, tend to use one, if not two, specific kind of creative tools. And I mean, some of it is a bit obvious, but the first one is the creative tool of constraint. And while it might at first seem like constraining yourself will somehow inhibit your creativity, it actually has the opposite effect, in that you suddenly are forced to contemplate a problem you never would have even engaged with because you thought it's not something possible. And so a really good example with this, with my work is, you know what? I got my notes out of order here. So that's okay. I'll come back to constraint. So let me start with this other one, which is, I guess, how you just lump together with fascination, or something that you can't, you can't stop looking at or being compelled by, and you're not quite sure why. And for me, like what I was talking about, Edward Gorey, that's a good example of why, of something that I kept looking at and engaging with, even though I didn't have an explanation for it. Another thing for me that's that same capacity is pencil sharpeners. And I love pencil sharpeners and I collect them. I have over 300 of them, and I have very specific rules about what I collect. They can't be sharpeners that collect shavings. They can't be novelty pencil sharpeners. And so I just love aesthetically the different shapes and the colors and the textures, but I don't really have a good reason for this. And so at some point I wanted to do a project, and I ended up combining both of these fascinations I had with Edward Gorey and the pencil sharpeners, even though I didn't understand them. And one of my favorite books by Edward Gorey, Little Stories, is the silent book where there are these gigantic curtain tassels that are in every page, kind of looming behind people. And I find it very funny and very frightening at the same time. And so I wanted to do some sort of homage to Gorey, and I thought, well, maybe I can do this with the pencil sharpeners. And what ended up happening was I created this book called Wedding Engines. And all of these illustrations from this book are in the museum as well. So if you want to see them over there, or you can see them on my website also. But essentially, I took my pencil sharpener collection and took some of my favorites, and I incorporated them into these scenes and made these gigantic sharpeners hovering ominously, interacting with people somehow. And there's something about these images that they make me laugh, but they also they kind of haunt me. And I don't understand them. I don't have a good explanation for them. But this little book is probably the most fulfilling creative project I've ever done. It's the thing that one of the things I'm most proud of, or I feel most connected to me. And I feel like this is because I was engaging with something that I didn't understand, but I knew that I was interested in. And so almost all of my little books and little projects and stories have an element of this in them. And it could be something as small as an emotion, like I witnessed something, just a small little interaction between people. And an example, when I told you about that crossing guard story, I had witnessed an old man who was a crossing guard, and these children that were walking by, and it was obvious the old man was having a great time, and he was trying to joke around with the kids, and the kids weren't having it at all. They were just kind of ignoring him and fed up with him. And that image stuck in my head for weeks and weeks and weeks. And eventually I thought, I need to do something with this. And I explored the idea, and that little book of the crossing guard is what came out. And it's not that it solved any problem or gave me any answers, but it was just the fact of trying to engage with this feeling that I couldn't describe why this was so compelling. I kept watching it over and over again in my memory of what I saw. So that is one of the main ways when I am approaching a story. Those are the kind of things I try to pay attention to. And if I do, the work tends to be much better than if I don't. And the other one, getting back to Constraint, again, I apologize for getting out of order here. So if you constrain yourself creatively, it forces yourself into a position you never would have put yourself by will. And so because of that, you end up having to come up with a solution to a problem that you never contemplated before. You might not feel like you're prepared for, but it ends up being something far more unique than most of the other work that you do. And so a good example for me is I have a couple of friends who do comics, and they make comics, and they have made several of these comics anthologies called speculative relationships. And what they do is for each issue they've put out, they ask a bunch of comic artists to write and illustrate a story to go in this anthology. The one catch is that every story has to be both a science fiction story and a romance story. And so when they eventually asked me to do, if I wanted to do a story for one of these anthologies, I immediately said yes, because I was excited to be involved. But then that was quickly followed by almost a moment of panic, where I realized, what in the world am I doing? Science fiction and romance are kind of almost as far away as you can get from most of the typical work that I do. And I spent a few weeks kind of just fretting about what in the world am I going to do for this story. But then at some point I was standing in a friend's kitchen thinking about this, and my eye fell upon their toaster, and I started thinking about how beautiful of an object this shiny kind of round piece of technology was. And then I had the thought of, well, 250 years ago, this toaster would have been science fiction. And so as soon as I had that thought, my mind started racing. Oh, I can do something with that. And what emerged was this story, which is called A Toasted Passion. And this is a little story about an elderly couple that has been married a long time, and they have lost all passion in their marriage. And they see an advertisement that is selling a product that is guaranteed to reignite any passions that have gone cold. And so the couple orders this product, and this gigantic box arrives. And when they open it up, there's a bunch of complicated instructions and parts that need to be assembled. And when they finally get it together, it's a gigantic toaster. And the rest of the book, they have to figure out what to do with this toaster or how it works. And you might be able to figure out where the story ends up, but I'm not going to tell it here. This is another story that all of the illustrations are in the museum. So you can read through the whole story, or you can see them all on my website if you want to read the story. But this is a perfect example of what I'm talking about of constraint, in that I never would have thought about making a story about a gigantic toaster and an elderly couple. But because I had those constraints and it forced myself to get out of my comfort zone, I created this story that I mean, it may not look like a regular romance story or a science fiction story, but it is far more science fiction and romance than any of my other books. So if you can find both ways to concentrate on ideas that come from things that you are compelled to follow or engage with, like the pencil sharpeners for me, or if you can find positions to put yourself in where you have a constraint, whether it's a time constraint or thematic constraint like this. I mean, it doesn't really matter. You can come up with all sorts of constraints. I think you'll find that it prompts greater things to come out of you that you didn't realize you had inside. So those are a couple of the creative tools I use. Now I'm going to talk about the technique I use for creating my illustrations. And this is the process I use is pretty much the same for no matter what I'm doing when I'm building up an illustration. There are variants depending on if it's done for a client or just for myself, or depending on the scale of the project. But I'm going to run through a number of examples here so you can see the common themes and also what's a little bit different depending on the job. So this was a project or a commission where a client wanted me to do an illustration. They gave me the requirements, and then the first step is I do a number of thumbnail illustrations. And so these are examples of my thumbnail illustrations. And these are about postage stamp size little drawings. And for me, this is the most creative part of the entire process of doing a drawing, because at this point, there are no wrong answers. This is just basically the brainstorming session. And so you can try whatever you want. There are no wrong answers, but if you mess up the drawing, it takes so little time to do that you just scratch it out and you start again and do a different one. And so once I have a number of thumbnails that I'm kind of happy with, in this case, I presented these three to the client, and they ended up selecting the third one on the right there. So if you look at that one with the map, the next step is I translate the thumbnail to a pencil drawing. And for me, this stage of the process, the pencil drawing, is the most difficult stage for me. This is in my mind where all the real work happens, because the pencil drawing is the skeleton essentially of the final illustration. If the skeleton isn't in place or isn't sound, the whole drawing is going to fall apart later. It doesn't matter what you do. So when I do the pencil drawing, I have to be fully concentrated on it. I can't be thinking about anything else. I can't have like a podcast going or anything of that nature. And consequently, the pencil drawing stage is usually the stage that I procrastinate more than any other stage of the drawing. But once I get the pencil drawing like this, the next stage that I go to is outlining. And I've come to realize that this is not how a lot of illustrators or comic artists work. I've had a friend who's a good comic artist who's teased me that I make coloring book pages for myself, which I guess I can't blame him for saying that, because that's essentially what I do. But this is what I have come to be comfortable with, and what works for me is I essentially just outline the pencil drawing. And once I have that in place, I feel safe. I mean, just like coloring in a sense, I know if I stay in the lines, things aren't going to get too wonky, and it gives me the confidence to proceed with the inking. So after doing the outline, then it's onto the inking stage. And the inking for me, even though it takes the most time out of any of the steps, it is by far the most enjoyable step for me. This is the point where the drawing comes alive, but it also is, it doesn't matter how long it takes. It's almost like inducing, at least for me, kind of a meditative state, making all the little marks. I can just kind of relax into enjoying the process of the drawing, drawing emerge. And I'm fine sitting there for a long time, just knowing that it's slowly getting completed. So that's kind of the rough process, and I'm going to show you several other examples of that. But before I do that, I want to talk specifically about inking and how I talked about with Edward Gorey with cross-hatching, that's what I have adopted as my primary method of rendering drawings. And cross-hatching essentially is just building up tones and textures with thousands and thousands of little marks. And the marks can go in varying directions, in varying widths, varying lengths, and then overlapping in any number of ways. And so this image here is a really good example of showing you, if you look in the upper left-hand corner there, that is 4 layers of cross-hatching in 4 different directions. And as you go out to the edge on the right and on the bottom, it's blending out from 4 into 1. And you will quickly see that there are diminishing returns the darker you get, but that's simply just because there's less and less white page left to utilize. Now, while this is extremely labor intensive, I find at least for myself personally, there are 2 distinct advantages or comforting advantages to me, which is why I continue using cross-hatching. The first being that since there are so many thousands and thousands of marks, each mark in and of itself is essentially inconsequential. And so if you make a mistake, there's time to correct it. That you can always kind of pop or push with another layer of hatching around that area and kind of blend it in. And so in my mind, it gives you flexibility to let the drawing slowly evolve over the process of the inking rather than taking kind of a bold stab right at the beginning. The second reason that I find cross-hatching work for me, and this is probably honestly the more important reason for me, is that I'm actually really insecure about my drawings, and I don't like my drawings, and I think I'm a rather poor draftsman. But if I'm doing the hatching, the hatching gives me confidence to show the work to other people, because even if they recognize that the drawing is poor, I feel like at least they can respect the amount of time that went into it, because you can immediately see with all the layers of hatching that this wasn't done quickly. And so as silly as it is, it's almost like a little mind game. It's something that allows me to get over my own insecurities, to share my work and to continue doing what I'm doing. So to sum all that up with the cross-hatching, I'm going to show you a quick little time-lapse video of me inking one of those little pet portraits I showed you at the beginning. And so as I'm going through this, you can take note of the different directions and lengths of hatching, as well as all the different layers on top of it to build up those textures. And you can then also see how I keep going back in certain areas to touch things up. And then this, also to give you a sense of time, this little drawing, which is I guess about a 4x6 drawing. This is about an hour's worth of inking condensed into what, I don't know if that was 30 seconds or something like that. So that gives you a sense of scale to the amount of time on a larger drawing. All right, so I'm now going to show you that same process of from thumbnail to ink drawing with a few other examples, and you can see kind of the differences and the similarities. This was another commission for a building front. So here's my thumbnail. This is the one that we went with, just a front, straight on view of this building. And then the hard work of making the pencil drawing. Unfortunately, for this, they had the original blueprint still of the building that I was able to look at, which definitely simplified this process. And then the hard work of making moving on to making my outline there. And then finally, the fun part of doing the inking. And so again, okay, now this is another one. This is an example of a thumbnail from that story I showed you an example, or one of the nursery rhymes earlier in the presentation, the Awful Underground. And now this thumbnail is rather rough. There's, it was kind of a crude exploration, but it also was me knowing that I would still need to work things out. And so I want you to pay particular attention though to the monster on the right. And that's, if you go to the pencil drawing, that's pretty much the only recognizable thing from, I'm going to go back there, you can see, I ended up having to change the perspective to make this work, as well as the monsters, except for that one monster, he kind of was the one part that remained the same. But after, okay, I had my pencil drawing completed, then making my coloring book page, and then kind of diving into the fun part of filling it in with the cross hatching. So again, the same process. And I'm going to show you this one more time, but this time a more extensive process or a closer look, because this was another art installation or drawing for an art installation, that same building in Memphis. Was also printed on glass 10 feet wide. And so this drawing, there was a lot at stake when doing this. And so because of that, it took a lot more planning, but the same steps are mostly still there. The main difference here is that rather than kind of jumping right into thumbnails, the client presented me with the idea. They wanted me to create my kind of fantasy version of what a pharmacy or apothecary looked like 100 years ago, kind of like my dream vision of what a magical apothecary would look like. And so I started by just kind of doing research on old glass bottles and medicines and salves and the packaging, and seeing kind of like what the shapes of these bottles are, just trying to get a feel for what the physical properties and aesthetics of that time period in that kind of location. And so that was kind of just immersing me in that world a bit. But then I went on to do my thumbnails. And so here you can see me kind of trying to work this out in a rough fashion. And if you look at the right-hand side there, you can see how I was trying to figure out where, if this was 10 feet wide and hanging on the wall, where an average person's eye line would kind of interact with this piece of glass if they were walking by it. And since it was such a large drawing, I then took my favorite thumbnails, or the ones that I was most happy with, and then I made larger, more refined thumbnails. I mean, these were probably then 5 by 7 inches, but they were still just rough drawings. And so these are kind of the 3 I chose. So this is just a head-on view of the pharmacy counter with the pharmacist behind the counter mixing up a medicine with pestle and mortar. And then the next idea was essentially the same, but kind of going to the corner so you'd get some perspective. And then the third idea, which as you saw from the completed illustration, was the one we ended up going with, was kind of more this idea of looking into the whole space, almost as like you could walk into it and seeing the angles and getting to see one of the pharmacists up on a ladder. And so the client and myself, we both liked this idea the best, and so we went with this. And so the next step, of course, was to do the pencil drawing, and this was even more complicated than usual because of what was at stake with this drawing. I spent a lot of time, at least for myself, laying out the perspective of the drawing. I wanted to be absolutely sure that things were right before I went in and started adding a bunch of little details. And so, I felt essentially like I was creating the stage. I needed to make sure the stage was in order before I could start inserting the props. And so once I had that all laid out, then I went in with the figures. But again, I didn't want to kind of mess up the drawing by having to erase figures and move them around. So I drew them on tracing paper so that I could kind of adjust them and tweak them about until I was happy with the position, and so that I thought they looked good with the perspective. And once I was finally happy with them, then I transferred them from the tracing paper onto the actual drawing. And then it was on to the outlining. And this took a long time, especially with this one, because of all the medicine bottles. But it was such a relief to get to the end of that process and know that I could dive into the inking. And so I'm going to show you the inking here in several stages. So you can see me kind of starting to work my way through, and also you can see a good sense of the scale of this drawing. If you look at the micron pens there at the top, and with with the labor intensity of the cross hatching, any small increase in size in a drawing exponentially increases the amount of time it takes to complete that drawing because of how many more hatch marks you have to make, and because you can't suddenly just make really wide hatch marks to fill in a larger space if you want to keep that consistent texture and tone throughout the whole thing. And so this was actually one of these drawings I did for this installation were the largest crosshatch drawings I've ever done in my life. This was 40 inches wide, and this project was monumental, but it took I don't remember exactly how long it took. It was probably about a month and a half or 2 months of work total, if you include the sketches, etc. But here's another good example of seeing how you can build up different tones and textures with the cross hatching. If you look at the figure of the man there, you can see the difference of fabrics and textures with the trousers and the vest to the suit jacket he's wearing. And here's another example where the drawing is partially hatched. And here you can really see the difference between kind of my outlines of the medicine bottles on the left there, and then how I fully rendered them after they were hatched. And so from there, you get the final drawing here. So you can see it zoomed out and in its full form there. So I think you can see now, or at least I hope you have a better understanding of how I approach doing my work, and especially kind of building up from start to finish. But I guess I want to end by leaving you a couple thoughts, and thoughts especially directed at anybody who's considering or endeavoring to go into a creative career. The first thing I would say is that it's definitely possible. It is, you can absolutely have a creative career in art or music or writing or whatever it is, if that's what you want to do. I mean, I know there's many people that will say it's not practical, and I agree it's not practical, but that doesn't mean it's impossible. But if you do want to do that, from what I've learned in my career to this point, there are two kind of tips I would suggest, or two tips I wish I had known when I was graduating college, or even earlier than that, I would suppose. And the first thought is that I would spend less time planning. And this goes back to what I was saying earlier. Not that planning is bad, not that you should never plan anything, but be less concerned about planning what the career is, and be more concerned about paying attention to those things that you just love doing, or that you are captivated by and you don't understand why. Whenever you notice something like that, something that you are drawn to and you can't explain it, pay special attention to that and explore it more and more and more. And that will lead you to things that you couldn't have predicted or planned. And I mean, I guess another way of thinking about that is to say, don't follow the money. And it's not that doesn't mean that you can live without making any money. What I mean by that is it's the things that you are willing to do for no money that are ultimately going to lead to opportunities to make money by doing things that you love doing, if that makes any sense. So that's the first main thought. And then the last thought, or last thing I would say, is to concentrate on cultivating what I like to think of as the tenacity of work. And what I mean by that is that every day that you continue to draw, or continue to play music, or continue to write, countless members or peers of yours are going to stop drawing, are going to stop playing music, are going to stop writing. And so just by the fact that you continue to work year after year, you will be exponentially increasing your skill compared to those around you. So thank you so much for listening to this. I hope it was at least that you were able to learn some things, or at least be amused by some of the stories. But I think we have some time now for questions that Stuart's going to moderate. Let me see if I can stop sharing the screen here. Oh, my mouse is okay.
Well, thank you, Landis. I appreciate your comments this evening. We do have a couple of questions.
Great.
The chat here, it says, how did you go about publishing those small books you initially made just for fun?
It was a learning process, and so I've done it in multiple ways, but essentially it was a matter of kind of learning basic just page layout, software, whether, I mean, you can use whatever software you want, but I was kind of learned the basics of Adobe InDesign so I could lay out my, the images themselves. But essentially, it's once you can create a PDF file, then it's a matter of where to go to print it. You can go to numerous places to have it printed. And the great thing about the now with the internet, there are so many options that you can, because of digital printing, you can print relatively small quantities of work, or even on demand for a not too great of a price. And so when I was originally doing those first stories, I was using some print on demand services where the cost for printing one book was the same as printing 10 books or 100 books. The only difference was the shipping was cheaper. And so even though the quality was not, when I see the quality of it now, I kind of cringe. At the same time, it was so exciting to get it because it was an actual object, it was an actual book. And so I guess all I'd say is like experiment with some things, but there's plenty of cheap on-demand services where you can get a copy of your book, like just to see what it looks like, for less than $10 or so. I mean, depending on how long the book is or how big it is. But as I started doing more of these and I wanted to increase the quality, it was just kind of a learning process. And once I was confident enough in what I was doing, then I paid a little bit more money to order, say 200 copies of a book, knowing I could get a better quality print. And then knowing at that point I was selling more of these at comic conventions. But you don't need to start, don't even start large. I mean, actually, one other thing I'd say about if you're interested in doing this, the best thing I would recommend doing, which I guess you can't do now during a pandemic, would be to visit an independent comic show. The best one in the Chicago area is Cake, but it's essentially independent comic artists coming together for a show. But you will see, I mean, professional things, but you will also see people printing stuff off at their on the printer at home and folding it and stapling it and selling it. And it's the first time I was at one of those kind of shows, it kind of completely changed my perspective of, oh, I don't need anybody's permission to do this. There's no proper way to do this. I could print this, or I could Xerox this at the Kinko's and staple it myself. And who's to say this is not a book? It's all a matter of what excites you and what kind of realizing that there are, as much as the industry might like you to think there are rules, there aren't really rules to creating something. So.
The other question in the comment, Landis, is, have you ever done a pet portrait or commission that you enjoyed so much that you didn't want to let go of it?
No, I guess the short answer is no. But I have had a friend threaten to commission me to do a drawing of like a silverfish or something, and and force me to spend all this time drawing a little insect or something in the. But it's something that, I mean, honestly, I do it. It makes people very happy, and it's a way that I can make some extra money on the side. And it's fairly, the good thing about it is it's fairly straightforward, as opposed to most other commissions I do for freelance work. It's the problem is much greater. You have to solve a problem that they're illustrating this article, and you have to figure out a solution visually that accomplishes that. Whereas with the pet portraits, it's pretty cut and dry. When here's the pet, they want it, I put the name on it, and I make a decorative border, and it's good because I don't have to overthink it. So I do enjoy doing it, and it's a way for me to keep practicing and make sure that I'm technically kind of not atrophying. But it's not. I've not secretly held on to any and redrawn them or anything.
Well, I have a quick question, and then there's a couple more we'll get to in the comments. I noticed in some of your illustrations, some of the figures sort of repeated, or they were ties back to other characters you had in your stories. Do you see those as sort of reoccurring characters, even though they may be unrelated in the storyline? Is it a little nod to a previous illustration or story that you've done? Yeah,
that definitely happens. Both intentionally and unintentionally, and part of that is the intentional ones are kind of, like you said, a nod to the other books, or me kind of almost putting in a secret joke to amuse myself, which I'm always excited when I see that in other people's work. It makes me happy, and so it's just a fun way to engage with it. But the unintentional ones are, I think anyone who, or at least I should say, I know a number of other people I've talked to that have the same problem, when you realize when you're drawing that you end up over time creating your own shorthand for things. And so when I draw a tree, I suddenly, if I'm not thinking about it, I resort to drawing this is the tree I draw. And the funny way that this appears is I've talked to comic friends and they said, yeah, it's so funny when you look at people that grew up in California, they always draw palm trees. Like that's like they just, without thinking, the background always has palm trees in it, and that because that's normal to them. And so as far as characters even go, there's certain shapes and the ways that I draw characters that they just, if I'm not careful, which frequently you're trying to get something done, especially if it's in the background, it ends up looking a lot like a lot of your other work. So.
Mm-hmm. You spoke a lot about Edward Gorey. Are there other inspirations for your styles of illustration? Let's see, let me read this. Your work reminds me somewhat of Albrecht Dürer.
Yeah, I mean, I love Dürer's work, and I mean, there's so many things that are inspiring to me. I mean, Edward Gorey is just kind of the top of that pile. And I should say it's kind of the inspiration both on the story levels and thematically as well as technically. And so that's kind of why I elevate him as this hero in my head, or he's kind of because it's combining all the things I like. Whereas there's technique of countless other artists that I admire. And so Dürer is definitely one. There's a bunch of other comic artists that are working today that are like, I mean, the one that I'm sure a lot of you know now is Emo Ferris, her book that came out last year or a couple years ago now, which is also done in cross hatching. But there's also other comics, Eddie Campbell's From Hell, with all the black and white cross hatching. But then if you look in art history, like it's just there, any of the old prints, looking at any engravings or any wood blocks, I mean, that's there's always, or at least I always find inspiration in them. But yeah, I don't know if that answers really the.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Any tips for making graphic novels?
Start small is what is the. I've known many people that they're starting out and they're very excited about doing comics, and they have this grand vision of a project to do, and there's nothing wrong with that. That's great to have large grand visions of something to do, but it's also the kind of thing that if making comics is so labor intensive that it's very easy to get disheartened and so if you want to do a 200-page graphic novel and you've not done a graphic novel before or much of any comics, it's going to be very difficult to keep yourself motivated to the end of that project just because you've never experienced something like this, as well as you are going to learn so much in the creation of the book that your skill level is going to be rocketing up. And then by the time you get to the end, the stuff at the beginning will probably be stuff you don't like anymore. I mean, I've had that experience with the hunting accident. Like when I look at the earlier drawings in the book, it bothers me how different they are from. I mean, other people say they can't really notice, but it's glaringly obvious to me. But so what I would say is, if you really want to do graphic novels, if you haven't done any comics before, try doing set a challenge of doing like a 20-page comic story and see if you can do it, and you will be far more likely to complete it, and you will feel good about yourself rather than feeling bad that you didn't finish a longer one. But also, if you finish it and then you realize, I didn't really enjoy this, then there's no guilt about not going on to finish the 200-page book, as opposed to then feeling like I never finished it. I'm a failure because I didn't finish my graphic novel. So yeah, so that's the best advice I would give for that.
Well, thank you so much this evening for taking time to speak with us. And thank you everyone listening and watching live for joining us this evening as well. If you want more information about Landis's work, you're welcome to find his artist website online. Do you have a URL?
Yeah, it's just landisblair.com. And that's also my handle on Twitter and Instagram. So.
Perfect. You can also see his work in our exhibition at the NIU Art Museum until February 26th. You can visit our website for free scheduled timed entries and our social distancing and mask wearing requirements as well, and any information that you need before your visit. you're welcome to join us and see his work in person. So thank you, everyone, for joining us. Thank you again, Landis.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
My pleasure. Good night, everyone.
Bye.